Good morning. Good evening. Good afternoon, and remember, context is everything. Media Network founder and CEO, John Michael, is reading a textbook, cover to cover. CEO, CFO, social media marketer, please like. Please subscribe. Thank you. I'm reading this textbook. I'm 663 pages in of 1007, and shortly we'll be starting more installments of the Media Network, that is, the Context is Everything Media Network. See, the name actually is kind of clever when you think about it, because I'm establishing my historical context by reading an entire history textbook. And context is everything, so it makes sense that I would read a textbook at the beginning. If you think that makes sense, please subscribe. Thank you. Chapter 26, Section 5, Impact of Imperialism. Please subscribe. Thank you. Setting the scene. In 1900, Rudyard Kipling was among the most popular writers in the English-speaking world. Kipling was born in British-ruled India, and after being educated in England, returned to India as a journalist for a number of years. His stories and poems often glorified imperialism and presented it as a romantic adventure. Like most British imperialists, Kipling emphasized the differences between what he saw as exotic India and his own English culture. In one famous poem, however, he recounted a dramatic clash between equals: a gallant Afghan chief and a heroic British officer. Though enemies, the two men respected each other and Like most British imperialists, Kipling emphasized the differences between what he saw as exotic India and his own English culture. Gallant Afghan chief versus a heroic British officer. Though enemies, the two men respected each other and act with great nobility and courage. The poem begins and ends with these lines: "Oh, east is east, and west is west, and never the twain shall meet, till earth and sky stand presently at God's great judgment seat. But there is neither east nor west, border nor breed, nor birth. When two strong men stand face to face, though they come from different ends of the earth." Rudyard Kipling, The Ballad of East and West. The age of imperialism brought confrontations between different cultures from the ends of the earth. By 1900, Western nations had unfurled their flags over much of the globe. That expansion set off radical changes that reshaped the lives of subject people from Africa to Southeast Asia to the Pacific. For their Western rulers, too, imperialism would bring about dramatic economic, political, and cultural changes. New economic patterns. New heading. New economic patterns. During the age of imperialism, a truly global economy emerged. It was dominated by the industrialized nations of the West, especially the United States, Britain, France, and Germany. From these nations, machine-made goods, investment capital, and technology flowed to the rest of the world. In return, the people of Africa, Asia, and Latin America provided agricultural goods, natural resources, and cheap labor. Most profits from this global exchange went to the industrialized nations. The demand of the New World economy disrupted traditional local economies in Africa and East Asia, as in Europe before the Industrial Revolution. Most people on these continents grew to produce goods by hand for local use. Under colonial rule, they were forced to supply products such as rubber, copper, and coffee needed by the industrial world. Money economy. Western capitalists developed plantations and mines, but relied on a steady supply of local labor to work them. At the same time, colonial rulers introduced a money economy that replaced the old barter system that existed in some of these countries. To cover the expenses of governing their colonial authorities imposed heavy taxes on their subjects. The only way that people could earn money to pay taxes was by working on plantations, in mines, or in projects such as railroad building. Well, that's not good. That seems like a really bad way to go about things. You live here now. We just walked in, and now we're here, and now we say you have to pay to live here, is what the colonial authorities said to the individuals who are natives. They said, okay, now you owe us taxes even though you live in the same place. Although I'm sure they had different goods and all that, but it definitely didn't work out. Families were disrupted as men left their homes and villages to work in distant mines or cities. In southern and East Africa, especially, many men became migrant workers. Their departure shattered families and undermined village life as women were left alone to grow food and support their children. On the other parts of the world, such as Japan and Latin America, sons were kept at home to farm while daughters were sent to cities to find work as domestics or the growing textile industry. Economic dependency. Mass-produced goods from the industrialized world further disrupted traditional economies. India, for example, was seen by Britain as a great market for its goods. It flooded the subcontinent with cheap factory-made cloth. The British textile industry flourished. Indian weavers were producing cloth by hand, however, and they could not compete, and they were ruined. Okay, so Indian weavers were producing cloth by hand, and the cheap cloth that the British imported put the people who made cloth by hand out of business. I misread it the first time I read it. So I'm just clarifying. Elsewhere, too, artisan-run businesses and handicraft industries were destroyed. Local economies had once been self-sufficient, became dependent on the industrial powers, which brought their new raw materials and supplied them with manufactured goods. When the demand and prices for crops or minerals were high, colonies prospered. When demand and prices fell, people suffered. In addition, because many workers were producing export crops rather than food for local consumption, famines occurred on lands that had once fed themselves. Modernization. Colonial rule did bring some economic benefits. Westerners laid the groundwork for modern banking systems. They introduced new technology and built modern communication and transportation networks. Capitalists invested huge sums in railroads, buildings to boost the export economy. Railroads linked plantations and mines to ports, which developers also modernized. From China to Chile, some local leaders and business people benefited from new economic systems. Countries like Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, for example, used export profits to develop industry, buy modern farm equipment, and promote growth. So what we're doing here is we're talking about imperialism, and this is the last section before we actually start a new unit about world wars, beginning with World War I. I believe what we're doing now is, as the name indicates, context being everything, we are setting the context, the global context for what was going on leading up to World War I. That's where we are now in this textbook. But we're just setting context with what seems to be boring, arbitrary information. But it's context setting, context building, and sometimes you need to do that work. Please like and subscribe. My name is John Michael. For the goodness of God, please. I'm sitting here reading this book, burning a hole in my pocket. I'm 665 pages in. Thank you. I appreciate your attention even if you don't subscribe. I'm just trying to be hyperbolic. Cultural impact, new heading. Like many other people in history, Europeans were convinced of their own superiority. During the age of imperialism, they also believed that they had a mission to civilize the world. Cecil Rhodes, a leading promoter of British imperialism, declared that the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race. If there be a God, I think what he would like me to do is to paint as much of the map of Africa British red as possible. Okay, Cecil. Westernization. As Westerners conquered the other lands, they pressed subject people to accept modern ways. By this, they meant Western ideas, government, technology, and culture. Thus, during the age of imperialism, modernization, Westernization came to be seen as one in the same. Many non-Westerners, especially in conquered lands, came to accept a belief in Western superiority. The overwhelming success of the Western imperialist nations sapped people's confidence in their own leaders and cultures. To share in the material advantages offered by Western society, business and professional people and others who had contact with Westerners learned Western languages, wore Western clothing, adopted Western manners, and embraced many Western ways. Other non-Westerners, however, had great misgivings about abandoning their own age-old strongly traditions. They greatly resented and often strongly resisted Western efforts to force new ways on them. The new imperialism spread Western culture around the world. Still, many regions were able to escape much of its influence, as remote areas of Africa and Middle East and Asia were farming villagers of nomadic herders, had virtually no contact with Westerners. As a result, their lives continued with relatively few changes. I believe there's still parts in the world like that today. How strange it is to consider. Schools and hospitals. Western culture was often spread by missionaries who built schools and hospitals. They taught children basic literacy and trained young men for jobs in colonial government. Western medicine brought many benefits. Missionaries introduced medical breakthroughs such as vaccines and modern methods of hygiene that saved lives. At the same time, however, modern medicine undermined traditional herbalists and local healers who sometimes possessed useful knowledge of the medical value of plants. I'd say that they, more than sometimes, possessed valuable knowledge on the medical value of plants. I'd say that they did very often possess valuable knowledge rather than sometimes. I would just boost it up one little grade of word. Sometimes to quite often. And they get to fill out the word count, Religion. Imperialism enabled missionaries to spread their Christian faith across the globe. They had great success in some areas. In southern Africa, for example, Christianity became widespread. Although Africans generally adapted its teachings and beliefs to their own traditions, in regions where other world religions on belief systems such as Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Confucianism were deeply rooted, Christian missionaries won fewer converts. Old and new ways. The pressure of Westernize forced colonized people to reevaluate their traditions. As in Asia, for example, people were proud of their ancient civilizations. On the other hand, they did work to discourage some customs such as the sati in India or foot binding in China, which they saw as harmful. I believe the sati, don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure the sati is when it's actually kind of touching. The sati is when a woman loses her husband to death. In the funeral pyre, I believe that's where the husband's ashes are created through a fire flame. The woman is tossed into it alive. The sati. I might be wrong about that, but that is a thing that did happen somewhere in ancient times, according to this book published in 2001. That's right. Okay. As people moved into cities that had become westernized, many still felt the pull of the past. People come to the city because they want to live, like Europeans, admitted one Nigerian, but we still feel close to our village and always go back to visit it. Should have done a different accent, but I don't know how to do any other accents than British ones. Impact on Western culture. Western cultures changed too during the age of imperialism. The Columbian Exchange, that had begun in 1492, picked up speed in the 1800s. Westerners drank coffee from Brazil, tea from Sri Lanka, and ate bananas from Honduras and pineapples from Hawaii. Their factories turned out products made from rubber harvested on plantations in Southeast Asia and South America. Archaeologists and historians slowly unearthed evidence about ancient civilizations previously unknown to the West. And this has happened again after this book was written, but textbooks wouldn't acknowledge it. Won't acknowledge it, or they haven't yet. Japanese. Westerners who studied Hindu and Buddhist texts, Chinese history, or Japanese poetry realized that they had much to learn from other civilizations. The arts of Japan, Persia, Africa, and Southeast Asia influenced Western sculptors and painters. Western manufacturers also copied designs from other lands, launching fashion from Egyptian furniture, Japanese kimono, and Chinese embroidery screens. And this will be the end of our time today, and this will be the end of the build-up to World War I. Monday, or in the next episode, we will start talking about the grisly warfare that we are kind of still feeling the aftermaths of today. New political tensions. Imperialism had global political consequences, as you have seen. Europeans claimed to and conquered large empires in Africa and Asia. They disrupted traditional political units such as tribes and small kingdoms. Often, they united rival peoples under a single government, imposing stability and order where local conflicts had raged for centuries. By the early 1900s, however, resistance to imperialism was taking a new course. In Africa and Asia, Western educated elites were organizing nationalist movements to end colonial rule. At the same time, the competition for imperial power was fueling tension among Western nations. In the Sudan, in 1898, British forces expanding south from Egypt and French forces pushing east from West Africa met at Fashoda. An armed clash was barely avoided. Elsewhere, the British and Russians played a cat-and-mouse game in Central Asia. The great powers, Germany, Britain, France, and Russia, tried to thwart one another's ambitions in Ottoman lands. More than once, Germany and France teetered on the brink of war over Morocco in North Africa. In 1914, and again in 1939, imperialist ambitions would contribute to the outbreak of two shattering world wars. Have a good day. I hope you enjoy the weather, and I hope that God sheds his blessings upon you, that God sheds his blessings upon all. And thank you. Please like and subscribe. This is like, this is subscribe. Please put this show on for your dog, on repeat, on loop, or choose one of my playlists, so while you're away from home, your dog can have company. It's like turning on the radio, but it's also helping the channel. Context is Everything Media Network. This is parody. Or is it? Goodbye.